Well, hello and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, everyday heroes and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio. And I'm your host, Ella. What is a whistleblower? A whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime, and these courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures. In the end, many of these people are often the catalyst for needed change and are eventually lauded as heroes, and I'm here to celebrate these heroes and give them a platform because shining a light on wrongdoing, wherever it occurs, plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. So with me today, I have Mr. Bradley Birkenfeld, who is considered one of the most significant financial whistleblowers in history. As an international private banker, he exposed how UBS, the world's largest bank, helped ultra-wealthy Americans commit billions in tax fraud. His bombshell revelations cracked the impenetrable fortress of Swiss banks, proving that offshore financial institutions systematically aided clients, tax evasion, corruption, and terrorist activities. His case triggered monumental changes in banking laws, the federal tax code, and international tax treaties. In 2005, despite a thriving career spanning Credit Suisse, Barclays Bank, and UBS, Birkenfeld could no longer keep silent about bank-enabled tax fraud. When UBS rejected his concern, he turned to the U.S. authorities. Though jailed for 30 months, he was soon vindicated with a record-breaking IRS reward in which he was awarded $104 million, and his work has enabled the U.S. Treasury to recover $15 billion in back taxes, fines, and penalties. And the case set off a domino effect of international investigations into offshore banking's secret crimes, including the Panama Papers and much more. Now retired, Birkenfeld is a philanthropist and supports whistleblowing efforts worldwide. He's taken his story to paper, and he has now written Lucifers Banker, The Untold Story of How I Destroyed Swiss Bank Secrecy, which was published in November 2016. So, Bradley, I just want to say thank you for joining me and agreeing to this interview. I've been looking forward to it, so thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I'm delighted to be here and to educate your audience. I think this is very important.
Yeah, I think it is too. It's very important, and it's so imperative that information like this makes it out to the general public, because many people aren't aware of everything going on. People are aware there's corruption, but they're not necessarily aware of exactly what's going on.
Well, I think you're right, and I think when we think about situations that ultimately get uncovered, I think Bernie Madoff is a perfect example. Harry Markopoulos, who's another whistleblower and a good friend of mine from Boston, he actually complained for a decade and no one would listen to him. And I think this is very telling about the way in which people have to understand that there's good people out there trying to correct wrongs and make them right. And I think what's happened is that sometimes they get a bad reputation or a bad label that, oh, you're a tattletale or a rat or whistleblower, what have you. But in fact, what society should be doing is embracing whistleblowers, because what they're doing is making society a better place for all of us to live.
Yeah, much agreed. Is there a way to get a little closer to your microphone? Because you're a little quiet.
Oh, is this better?
Oh, much better. Thank you for that. So
Yeah.
one thing I'm curious about is what led you into investment banking? You know, where did you grow up? I believe you grew up in the Boston area, and what made you interested? I mean, obviously there's, you can make large sums of money. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that, your background.
Sure. Well, I'm the youngest of three boys. My parents raised us in a very wonderful neighborhood in a town called Hingham, south of Boston. And my dad's a retired neurosurgeon. My mom was a nurse and a housewife. So we had a very loving family and a very wonderful childhood. So as I grew up, I was able to go to private school, and then I went into a private military school for university up in Vermont, where I was enjoying the challenges of trying to challenge myself as a young man. And that was something that really sort of, I think, shaped some of my ideas with respect to endurance and independence and trying to do things on your own rather than just relying on your parents for everything. Sometimes you had to do it yourself. So I went to school in Vermont at Norwich University, and then I spent my last semester of college in London. And I learned a lot about myself traveling overseas at that time. And when I graduated, it was right after the 1987 stock market crash. So it was a very tough time. As we all know, that period was very hard. A lot of people were laid off. And you realize that this was just one step in the process of having to overcome hurdles and obstacles in life. So that resonated very well with me, and I thought that it was important to understand the significance of there's things that will happen in events that you have no control over, and you hopefully can overcome them. So I was very happy to come back to Boston at that point, even though I wanted to stay in Europe. But and then I started with the bank I worked in Summers, which was State Street Bank in Boston. And I worked as a currency trader and handling cash management and credit facilities and so forth. So I actually learned a lot about the business and expanded my knowledge base by talking to banks around the world. And we were managing billions of dollars in institutional pension fund money. So we were on the buy side, advising clients and investing their money conservatively. And this was very interesting because I was surrounded around people with PhDs and MBAs and CFAs and all these wonderful acronyms for the investment professionals. And I made a lot of friends, and I had a lot of wonderful memories of those days. But at some point, I just felt as though it was time to move on. I was eager to get back to Europe, actually, and to get a master's degree in finance. So most of my friends were sort of criticizing me, why are you going overseas? Why don't you just do it here in Boston at Boston College or Harvard or what have you? And I said, no, I need to go to some place where I don't know anybody. I want to find new horizons and so forth. And I was challenging myself once again. And this was critical because I think anybody who's traveled, not just traveled, but I went and literally picked up my whole life and moved overseas. Sold everything I had in Boston and then moved to Switzerland to get an international MBA. So I was immersed in a culture that was different, obviously, from the American culture. I was surrounded with a lot of European and Asian kids. And this was very important because what it did was not only the students, but also the faculty were also very international as well. So on any subject, whether it was business law or econometrics, or marketing or what have you, you got a different perspective than your own. And that was something that was very valuable. And I respected that, and I thought it was important to listen rather than talk all the time, because I thought sometimes other people have a better point of view and maybe a better argument than you do. So this was a very good time. And then what happened was, while I was finishing my MBA, I literally got hired out of school by Credit Suisse Private Banking in Geneva, Switzerland.
Okay, so that's how you ended up there. And yeah, the European culture is wonderful. I mean, my family's European, so I've spent, a good amount of time there. So I'm sure that was a wonderful experience.
It was. What it was not just the education, advanced education, and it was a small school. It wasn't a large university by any means, which was much more manageable. But it was more of the cultural aspects outside of the classroom, such as Nestle World headquarters were right down the street from our school on beautiful Lake Geneva. We were looking at the French Alps across the lake from our school. We would go skiing on the weekends or boating on the lake. And it was a wonderful crowd. And again, it's everything Switzerland can conjure up. Beautiful, clean countryside, wonderful gourmet cuisine, a wealthy country, of course, a safe country, politically stable country. So it's really the iconic place to live if you can afford it. And as a student, it was really quite attractive because I was getting the best of both worlds. I was enjoying the lifestyle, but also getting an international MBA. So it worked out quite well. And I still keep in touch with several of my student peers from the MBA. And living in Europe now for me is really quite nice because I do travel quite extensively and lecture, as I say, for my book, Lucifers Banker. But I think what has happened is when I came out of the academia and moved into the workplace, it was a totally different mindset because the Swiss mentality, especially working in a Swiss private bank, was something totally foreign to me and to any banker who'd never worked in Switzerland, because this was an ultra secret sort of boys club, if you will. And this worked for many reasons, because if you really look at the fundamentals of why Swiss bank secrecy existed, it made sense. It made sense in the sense that if you think about attorney-client privilege or you talk about medical privilege. This was financial privilege, meaning, you just don't share this information to everybody. Unfortunately, this got abused over the years after World War II. And then there was cross-border trade, and there was a lot of money flowing. So Switzerland was the ideal location, not just for a vacation and medical treatment and so forth, Swiss watches and everything we use as a stereotype, but also because it was economically and politically stable.
Why World War II? Why do you think that occurred? Because of the war and hiding money, and families in Germany trying to hide their money.
Well, I actually did a lot of research on this when I was in Switzerland, and I still have a lot of the information. It's fascinating, actually. What really happened was in 1933, when the Third Reich came to power, Adolf Hitler mandated anyone to be shot who moved a Pfennig or any money, German currency, out of the country. And the reason for that was very simple. One, they had huge war reparations after World War I, and they weren't happy about it. Even though that they were the aggressors. But number two, obviously Adolf Hitler was a bit psychotic and a dictator in his own right. And he had ordered this to keep the money in the country for the war effort for the upcoming World War II. So that was in 1933. In 1934, the Swiss countered that with Swiss bank secrecy in Article 47, 1934. And they put it into the Swiss Constitution that they would never disclose the identity of a client who opened an account in Switzerland. So it was a tit for tat, if you will, and this is their southern neighbor, Switzerland, south of Germany, of course, and it borders them. So I think what had happened was, initially it was a good idea. It was there to counter that. Unfortunately, the Swiss were playing both sides of the fence. They were saying they were neutral, but yet they were dealing with the Nazis. The other argument is the Nazis could have easily invaded Switzerland, but Switzerland then threatened to dynamite all the tunnels and bridges for the trains. Now, if you look at the map, you'll see that Germany had to go through Switzerland to get to Italy and to the North African theater, and that was critical to move arms and supplies and troops and so forth. So there was this wink, wink, nod, nod between the two countries. Switzerland then became the bank of the Third Reich, because who else was going to do banking with the Germans? It wasn't going to be the French or the British or the Dutch or the Spanish, for that matter. It was going to be the Swiss. So this was something very, very nefarious, if you will. And I think the problem is that history shows us that this was a very dark time. And then, of course, we all know the scary Holocaust issue that emanated from the Third Reich, and so many Jews perished, but also so many assets perished. Now, the lives are obviously more important, but assets which can manipulate anyone, whether it's cash, gold, artwork, whatever you have. So this was a very troubling time, and it was hard to understand that this little country in the middle of Europe is neutral, but everything around it was a disaster. Germany annexed Austria, of course, and then invaded France, and so on and so forth. So what had happened was, after World War II, again, there was so much money moving around, and this was a problem, because how are you going to identify who owned what? I mean, let alone rebuild Europe, because Germany was in shambles, and then the Marshall Plan came in and so forth. But rather than give you a history lesson, I think it's important to understand that the assets, the hidden assets in Switzerland was critical for that country to develop even further. And what it was an attraction for other countries, individuals as well as governments and dictators, to move their monies to Switzerland, legally and illegally. So at some point, you began to realize that Switzerland was sort of the world's bank, and all the famous movies you've seen in James Bond where people are hiding money in numbered accounts. It's true. That's exactly what was going on. And the problem was that, as I said, as trade developed between countries, cross-border trade, shipping, and then the development of the airline industry, it made it easier for people to be more mobile, as well as assets and trade to develop. So that's what really happened. And then you really got into some of the bad businesses where you had insider trading, extortion, bribery, drug running, arms smuggling, and then later was terrorist financing, of course, which is extremely serious. And So you had a whole array of illegal conduct going on. And Switzerland would never answer to any foreign government. Now, the problem is that we knew that this was going on, but the governments didn't do anything. So in essence, these governments are complicit because they're actually aiding and abetting this, because they knew it was going on but did nothing to stop it. And in my experience at UBS in Switzerland, we had something called PEPs, politically exposed people. We had a dedicated desk out of Zurich who handled just politicians out of Washington. Now, the fact of the matter is that we had 19,000 U.S. citizens with $20 billion in assets. Now, that's just one bank managing U.S. money. And that was the biggest bank handling U.S. money because it was a complicated market. Credit Suisse did as well. But this is the problem. In Little Geneva, which was about 200,000 residents, we had 130 banks. Now, that equates to about 1,700 per capita per bank, and it wasn't Swiss money in those banks. You had German desks, you had French desks, Spanish desks, Japanese desks, Asian desks, Middle East desks, African desks, and so forth, meaning dedicated desks that marketed to those regions around the world to attract wealthy money. And if you don't have accountability and transparency, what you get as a result is illegal and illicit business. People are doing things, not just evading taxes from, say, a spouse or from a business partner or from IRS, but also doing those other illegal acts which I delineated before.
Right.
So this was a very big industry that was impenetrable. I mean, literally. So 130 banks, I mean, you can imagine. I mean, this was quite a machine. And it was a cash society in Switzerland. Everybody carried cash. I could go to an ATM and take out 25,000 in cash.
Right.
There's no problem. It's the way it was. I bought a Ferrari for cash, 250,000 Swiss francs in cash. And there was no questions. No one would ask a question. Where did you get the money? What are you doing with this? It was like a fantasy land, and it was a very large cash society. And it's hard to describe to your audience because living in there was quite normal to walk around with 2,000 Swiss francs in my pocket, which was $2,000 in essence. Prices were higher, things cost more, but we got paid a lot more. Mm-hmm. Salaries were 200, 300,000 Swiss francs, 8 weeks of vacation, all expenses paid and so forth, because you were managing the wealthiest of wealth in the world.
But you kind of knew getting into this business that there was some corruption, or did it surprise you how deep the corruption was?
Well, corruption goes in different angles. What we did in Switzerland was totally legal. Opening a Swiss bank account for any person was protected under the Swiss Constitution, and it's a sovereign country, so you have to respect that. If, in fact, they're breaking laws of other countries, that's where they run afoul. And on the U.S. desk, you didn't see... I mean, I didn't personally see, say, clients that were drug smugglers or arms dealers or things of this nature. Those generally went into countries in the Middle East and in Asia, South America, Africa, where the laws were very loose. There was so much corruption. Not to say there's not corruption in the U.S. government. There was and is. And I witnessed a lot of that going through my ordeal. But I think it's important to understand that this was the kind of thing that Switzerland would say, well, that's not our problem. We're bankers here. But unfortunately, it's not the way the world works. The moment you step outside of Switzerland, that's when you run afoul into the law. Whether you're licensed to go into a country, whether you're able to market to clients and so on and so forth. And that's really where the problem is. So I think what had happened was these banks became so powerful and so greedy and so profitable that the money was pouring in. I mean, we were literally opening accounts every day for clients, not just the U.S. desk, but all these other country desks that I had mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And there are laws for certain countries where you're allowed to move money offshore, like the UK. You're legally allowed to move money out of the UK, and you have different accounts, mm-hmm. and you can do that. But other countries such as Germany and France and Spain and Italy, you cannot. And It just varies. So, well, the Middle East, they don't have any tax laws. So moving money there was no issue about tax. But then the problem came into terrorist financing. So it just depended upon the country you were dealing with and the clientele, as well as, did the story make sense? I mean, someone to walk in the bank with, say, a $10 million account wasn't uncommon. I mean, some people find that strange, but this was a magnet for the rich. And there's a lot of money in the world and a lot of money that's being made in oil and gas, in construction, real estate, and shipping, artwork, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But as I said before, if there's not accountability and transparency, you just don't know what's going on, which lends itself to illegal conduct.
And you represented Americans, of course. So, and I would imagine, and I've heard a few of your interviews, that the clients requested, 95% of your clients had requested to have their money in an illegal tax haven, such as Swiss bank accounts. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That is correct. And look, no one's going to travel 8,000 miles, whether from New York or from LA, to open an account in Switzerland to pay high fees of 3, 4, or 5%. Because they think that the chocolate tastes good. I mean, it's,
it does taste pretty good. But I wouldn't fly to Switzerland for that. That's what Amazon's for.
Well, that's it. And I think the thing is that, Swiss watches, Swiss chocolates, Swiss ski vacations, and so forth is a great thing. But the main crux of why people went there was to bankable assets, and it went on for years, and actually it was generational. I mean, several times I had to go and see children of deceased parents and tell them they have this Swiss bank account, which they had no idea it even existed. So all of a sudden someone knocks on your door and says, "Oh, hi, Ella, by the way, I'm here from Geneva, and can we have a coffee and talk?" And then all of a sudden, you find out that your grandmother from Italy passed away, and there was $20 million in the bank account with your name on it.
Huh.
Yeah.
And so the banks weren't absorbing this money. There was ethics set in place for situations like this.
The transitional banking was very important because it would be something along the lines of, well, for an American, for instance, they would say to you, okay, you can take the money back home and declare it, and you're going to pay 50% tax or something like this, as a round number. So 20 million becomes 10 overnight. And then you say, but we could open another account in your name and you have a whole new Swiss numbered account and we can continue servicing you in this fashion. Most of the people did the latter. They kept the money offshore just because it was already there, and they continued doing it. And the banks were very compelling in their discussions with the clients because the clients figured, well, I just don't want to open up a can of worms and so forth. So it was a bit of a quagmire for some, but most of them just kept the money there in Switzerland. So again, remember, I'm sorry, you would have, remember, think of it this way, you had no income tax. And again, let's just say your taxable rate in the U.S. is 40%. So you had no income tax, you had no capital gains tax, you had no inheritance tax. So in essence, you were free to, say, spend $10, $50, $100,000 on stocks. If you made $100,000, it was all of yours.
Well, then the next question might be to the listeners and to myself, how were they getting the money back into the States or whatever country they were in? I know you can wire, it has to be less than 10,000, but you can still get their attention if it's happening in numerous, what's the word I'm looking for, numerous times. So I'm just curious now if you could answer how they were getting the money back in the States or to these various countries that they resided in.
Well, let's take a step back for a moment and let your audience understand that, remember, these are very wealthy people. If you had enough money in America to become wealthy and then have enough money to put over in Switzerland, you were quite wealthy. And whatever your gauge of wealth is, our minimum account size, by the way, was $1 million. So, this wasn't, the plumber down the street opening an account or what have you. This was people who made large sums of money. Let's say movie actors. We had movie actors and the people that were actually doing this. I was looking after Kevin Costner's account with my boss. I managed his currency there on his account at UBS. Oh, yeah.
Very
Yeah.
interesting.
And Estee Lauder, she had an account at UBS in Switzerland. She was my account. When she died, I had her death certificate in my hand. But what it meant was you had to think about what did these people's lifestyle mean about having a Swiss bank account. Now, a lot of people will argue, oh, it was a declared account and so on and so forth. That's wrong because the desks that we worked on were all undeclared business. And a lot of people try to argue with me that, they were innocent and this and that. Well, they weren't innocent. And that's why my whistleblowing was so cataclysmic for the industry. But the point being is that when these people had all this money, they weren't interested in bringing it back to the States necessarily. What they were coming over to Europe to vacation and have a party or what have you. So you might go to the French Riviera and we would arrange to make sure your hotels were all paid for. Or you had a villa in Spain or a ski chalet in Austria or a cruise in the Mediterranean or whatever.
Well, what's the long-term goal? I mean, they're just going to keep it there for generations, or I'm just curious what the long-term goal is. They obviously can't spend all this money in their lifetime, I'm sure. So give me an example of what someone's goal was.
Well, that's a good point. To be honest with you, what it really was you were hiding money from a spouse. That was one thing. You were hiding it from a business partner. That was possibly another reason. And you were hiding it, obviously, from the tax authority, the IRS. So those are the three main things. Now, if you really delve down deep, and we'll get into something more nefarious, such as very easy to do insider trading. Someone tells you a stock tip and says, hey, Nestle's going to have poor earnings, and you have a friend at Nestle to tell you that, you short the stock. And you're in a numbered account. No one knows. So there's a little bit of that sexy game there that, wow, I've got this secret numbered account. No one knows. I got my own private banker. I can do my own thing. We had clients who were, quite frankly, they were paying mistresses. And that was secret. You had people that were indulging in a lifestyle that was above and beyond what you would ever do in your own country. So you can imagine with this money, it wasn't necessarily think like, oh, it's going to be there forever, but certainly you would pass it on to maybe children you might have, but they didn't know the account existed. So one day it would just come up and say, well, Dad passed away, and then someone knocked on the door and it was a banker from Switzerland. So you had those types of situations as well. But I think the main thing was people would come to Europe to enjoy that money. And a lot of the Hollywood stars, how they put their money in Switzerland was they would do movies in, say, Eastern Europe, let's say Hungary or in Poland or wherever it might be. And let's say their contract was for $8 million. Well, maybe $3 million would come back to America and $5 million would go directly to Geneva. So it was legitimate. I mean, you tried to legitimize it. Like, oh, yes, I did a movie in Hungary and $3 million got paid and here's the contract. And okay, it came into Bank of America and $5 million came to UBS in Geneva.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I knew models in the 90s, when I was modeling, and they were making it overseas, and I would hear all this talk, but some people, I don't know why they were deterred sometimes from the Swiss bank accounts. They were more like in the offshore, the Isle of Man, and all these various places in Singapore. So I never really understood. I didn't have that kind of money, but the other models, some of the models I work with, they were getting like $1 million contracts and getting paid millions of dollars overseas. I didn't understand, so I don't know why many that I knew, at least a dozen, didn't want to put it in the Swiss bank accounts. And I never really understood.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, again, it just depends upon maybe you had an agent or a friend who would steer you in a particular direction. You might have had a girlfriend that actually already had an account in, say, Monaco, so you put it in Monaco and you go down there and spend vacation, or who knows what. There's, agents, lawyers, friends, whatever. All it takes is someone close to you to say, no, I think you should do it this way. And that's really what it is. You trust someone close to you, and certainly you're not going to advertise what you're doing because it's very secretive. Switzerland, of course, was the ideal place because, one, you had Swiss numbered accounts, unlike any other country, but you also had a great lifestyle there. You could go there for beautiful, great medical treatment, dental care. The schools for children were excellent. Boarding schools there are world renowned. gourmet cuisine, great skiing, great watches. You're in the center of Europe. You drive in any direction. A couple of hours, you're in France, Germany, Austria.
Yeah, they're
Italy.
very close, almost like our countries. One of the questions I wanted to ask before we get too far into it is, what's the most amount of money that you're willing to admit that you had helped a client on an individual basis?
I helped a couple of clients with over $150 million move their money to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And some of these clients were quite big. Now, again, you have to ask yourself, is it just the initial amount or the recurring amounts? Because we had some clients, I had a few clients from the Middle East who came in tranches of $25, $30 million every 3 months. So it's quite an impressive amount of money. But at some point, you got used to these numbers. They didn't really faze you because, I mean, you watched it. We were very diligent with and prudent with the investments. I certainly didn't try to sell UBS products all the time. I was more interested in doing more of the entrepreneurial banking, meaning I was trying to find out how the clients made their money. There's only two ways you really earned money. One, you inherited it, or two, you earned it. You had a business or what have you. Or the lottery. Some people won the lottery and brought the money to Switzerland. So what I began to do was look at the client and say, well, how did you make your money? Was it in the hotel industry? Was it in the car industry? Was it in real estate? Whatever it might have been.
Well, I'm sure you had drug dealers and mob and people like that as well. I'm sure they all didn't earn money in a legitimate way.
Well, the funny thing is that what people don't realize is the sophistication of illegal business is far beyond the reach of law enforcement because they're so 5 steps ahead of them. And,
of course.
Just to give you an example, I mean, we knew cases where people who were in the drug industry would then use the money to buy a couple of hotels in Spain. Then they sell the hotels in Spain a few years later for a profit, and then buy, let's say, a golf course in Italy, and then all of a sudden they've laundered all the money and said, no, see, I have a golf course in Italy. It's very valuable.
Restaurants and bars and all those places that used to take cash. What a great place to do those type of things, those type of activities.
Well, yes, that was small potatoes, like laundromats and restaurants, because yes, it's still, people did do that, that's for sure. But
yeah, I guess in the grand scheme, that'd be kind of small for when you're talking about multi-millionaires and billionaires. So
exactly, people buy a building for $50 million, sell it for 75. Or what would happen is people would get kickbacks on introductions.
I see.
Oh yeah. A lot of people got paid monies for introductions on a business deal, an oil deal, a shipping deal, a hotel deal, you name it. And we saw these all the time, contracts after contracts. And Switzerland is a landlocked country, and 80% of all the oil contracts in the world go through Switzerland. And you might say, well, how is that possible? Well, because there's sophisticated structures set up. Oil trading companies, the Russians, the French, the British, the Americans are in Switzerland, and they're trading oil contracts as well as deliverables through offshore companies in Switzerland. And it's very attractive, it's very profitable, and it's a low-tax jurisdiction to do it. So just that alone, the oil industry is massive. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one component of so much of it. Then, of course, you have many other industries, such as the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry. I was
going to bring that up earlier because that's one of the, I would imagine, one of the wealthiest businesses that exists, especially coming from America.
Yes, pharmaceutical industry is quite lucrative, but it sort of pales into comparison when you're looking at the military industry, when you're selling jets. Oh yeah, India buying jets from the British and the French, selling them to Pakistan, and Americans to Saudi Arabia, and out to Asia, into Thailand and Australia and so forth. You had a lot of different contracts in military contracts. The commissions alone were hundreds of millions of euros or dollars or what have you. So you can imagine, and those were recurring contracts. So that was another huge industry. So it touched every industry in the world. Nothing was immune to this. And I think when you begin to realize works and functions, you begin to see that it is really the money center of the world was Switzerland, because multiple languages they spoke: Italian, French, German, English.
Yes.
Multiple currencies. You could have accounts in 6 or 7 different currencies: euros, pounds, dollars.
Lira. No, was it liras? What else? I know there's a few.
Before the
It's changed
euro,
now. Yes.
yeah, it's changed to the euro, but you had liras, French francs, Deutschmarks, and pesetas, and so forth. But then you had the yen, the pound, the Swiss franc, the dollar. So again, it gave people a comfort level, like, this is politically stable, economically stable. I have multi-currencies. I have multilingual staff. And no one knows my business. And I can go there and have a wonderful vacation. I can take your wife or girlfriend or whatever to a nice holiday, ski holiday, buy a nice Swiss watch, not be aggressed. Nothing's going to be stolen and so forth.
Sorry to interrupt, we have like 20 minutes left, so I really want to get into the whistleblowing. That's the meat of the story. Sure. What happened? I know you went to prison. I'd like to hear a little bit about that. So can we get into that area? And what happened and why you did it exactly?
Well, I think the problem we have, and I write about it in my book, Lucifers Banker, is that the Department of Justice is really the problem here. And a lot of people will say, well, you're just bitter because you got caught and this and that. I said, well, no, I didn't get caught. I actually came to them. They didn't even know I existed. So when I whistleblew, I actually resigned from the bank when the bank did not heed my warnings about what they were doing illegally. And I went to my legal and compliance departments for multiple months with no answer. Now, I'm a director of the bank managing around $450 million.
Wow.
And I was the head of business development. Yeah, so I mean, why aren't you answering me? So I put it in writing. I have all these documents, and they never answered me. And then finally I resigned. And at that point, when I resigned, I then took my concerns to the board of directors of the bank in Zurich, which really put them on the hook, because they said, now this is your problem and it's documented that you've been delivered this document. So they called an investigation and they covered it up. They asked for my assistance, which I gave them some information. And then I found out a few weeks later through my colleagues at the bank that it was a cover-up. So I had taken documents out of the bank that were given to me. I didn't steal any documents from the bank, and I never tried to sell any documents. I just moved documents across the border. Geneva is right on the border of France, so I put the documents in archive boxes in a friend's barn in France. In case they raided my home in Geneva, they wouldn't have found anything. So I was being
Can I interject a quick question here? Were you scared? I mean, you must have had fears. You must have been frightened. I mean, what was going on through your head? I'd just like to touch upon that real quick, because I can't imagine what you were thinking. I really can't.
Well, remember, we're on a desk that manages $20 billion, and I'm there sort of looking around and thinking I have to be very cautious and careful about what I say. I didn't use my mobile phone. I didn't use my computer at home. None of that. I used to go to payphones at night to call my attorneys in the States, and I would change payphones. I would send FedExes from hotels. So it was really a spy kind of sleuth novel in the sense that I was actually doing this because I couldn't trust anyone and I couldn't tell anyone. So this was the other problem. It was sort of, you're challenging yourself to see how this is going to work. And that's exactly what I did. So when all of this sort of hit, I had the documents across the border in France, and then I made multiple trips back and forth to the States and brought documents with me. And you have to understand, I tried to get a law firm in America, but they were all conflicted. The major firms were all represented by UBS, which was another problem. So in essence, when they covered up the investigation in Switzerland, that's when I was so furious, and I finally went to the States. And I was really relentless in my pursuit of justice and equity. So what happened was, by going to the United States and bringing these documents, they were so compelling. I had accounting documents. I had PowerPoint presentations, internal emails. I mean, it was a treasure trove. And by bringing this to the government, my problem was I went to the Department of Justice. Now, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, if the Department of Justice was so good, why didn't they uncover this crime over the last 5 decades? They didn't. That's the first problem. The second problem is, when I came in, I had to educate them. These people were absolutely useless. They had no idea what I was saying. And I tried to convince them through the way to catch the bankers going to the U.S. You could subpoena documents from the hotel, the phone records. You could get their laptops and their mobile phones and so forth. And they didn't want to hear it. They said, you watch too much TV. That's Hollywood. And I'm like, well, I think I know better than you, and you're just being really ridiculous. So these are the types of people I was dealing with at the Department of Justice. The third problem was, not only did I give them, they didn't uncover it, and then I had to educate them, but when I gave it to them, they screwed up the whole case. I mean, the bank got a deferred prosecution agreement. All of my bosses got secret non-prosecution agreements, which is illegal because my boss pleaded the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. Senate. This is all on my website. You can see it there. And the fact that they deceived Congress and didn't tell them this was that they were covering for very powerful people in Washington. People in the Bush administration, people in the Obama administration, they're all dirty. This was the problem. And believe it or not, when I even wrote my book, I sent it to every member of Congress by FedEx, every single one, even the president. 3 Republican senators sent me letters back, only 3, and they were Republicans, nobody else. So it just goes to show you that people didn't want this story to be told. They just didn't like it. No publisher in America published my book. I had to self-publish it. Because the problem was, when I did my whistleblowing, at the time I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, the U.S. Senate, and the Department of Justice. I did that so that they would fight amongst themselves and they couldn't cover it up. So I was being very cautious. I was being very clandestine, if you will. But the problem later evolved where it was announced that even Senator Obama was on the U.S. Senate committee I went to, investigating the criminal conduct of UBS, but he never attended any of those meetings. But at the very same time, Ella, he was accepting millions of dollars from the chairman of UBS in America for his political campaign.
That's interesting. I was listening to one of your interviews and I heard that and I was quite shocked.
And it's documented. It's there. He was an active member of the committee. He never showed up. And they were under criminal investigation, and yet he was taking money from the chairman of the bank. I mean, that's a treasonous offense. I mean, to be frank, I mean, I'm not Republican or Democrat. I'm just telling you that this is wrong. Eric Holder, as Attorney General, when he was in private practice at Covington and Burling, represented UBS. And then the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, she had secret meetings with the Swiss. And this was so dangerous because what she had done was she fixed the settlement with UBS. And there's a document that was exposed by WikiLeaks that showed it was a CIA secret cable that showed that Hillary Clinton was having secret meetings with the Swiss to settle the UBS case for political purposes. Now, this is very dangerous. So this shows the dark state of that administration. And certainly the Republicans, I'm sure, had dealings, Iran-Contra with Reagan and so forth. No one's innocent here. But the fact of the matter is, across the board, these groups of people I just mentioned, Hillary Clinton, Eric Holder, and Barack Obama, were aiding and abetting criminal activity, clearly. They had an oath to the U.S. Constitution to defend the Constitution and the American people, and they didn't do that. And that's what's so powerful. That's why nobody wanted to publish my book. That's why nobody puts me on television in America. But when I come to Europe, everyone's so eager to hear this story because it's so powerful. It revolutionized $1 trillion industry. One man, a courageous whistleblower. And by the way, I was the only whistleblower in the whole lot, and I was the only banker to go to prison in the whole financial crisis.
You were the only whistleblower that whistleblew on the Swiss banks, period,
exactly.
that I could find.
Oh, yeah, it was just me. I was the first one.
Shocking.
There was some after me. Yeah, and it was, I mean, this is $1 trillion, a multi-trillion-dollar industry, which I totally changed. Today, there's 80 banks in Geneva when there was 130. That means 50 banks either went bankrupt or merged. 50, gone. I mean, this is staggering. And you've had hundreds of billions of dollars leaving Switzerland banks, clients were moving their monies. People were moving to new jurisdictions, new financial institutions. The share price dropped from 75 to 20. Fines have been happening across Europe and Asia against UBS and other Swiss banks. The U.S. government collected $15 billion and counting. And Ella, that's through perpetuity. That money comes back to America and it gets invested and taxed forever. So the numbers are staggering of what I achieved for the United States government and for the U.S. people. One person, courageous whistleblower, did this all, and I was the only one to go to jail. How is this possible?
Were you shocked by your sentence?
Oh, it was a joke. The judge in Florida is a total sham. I mean, this was forum shopping. I had nothing to do with Florida. Mm-hmm. The Department of Justice picks a judge in Florida, and the very fact this judge has a track record of concealing his own assets, Judge Locke.
I was just thinking about that. I'm like, I wonder if they have their money stashed away in Switzerland or had.
Oh, well, it's interesting. He was one of the federal judges that the Supreme Court Justice Rehnquist demanded every federal judge in the country show all of their assets, and this one judge refused to do it, and he threatened with taking him off the bench. So this guy is just bad news, and that's why the DOJ picked him. I mean, the very fact that they didn't uncover this whole tax scandal that had been going on under their noses proves they were part of the problem, not part of the solution. So you begin to realize that the U.S. government is in bed with the Swiss. And if your audience goes onto my website under DOJ corruption, they can see some of these documents and UBS scandals. But it only takes a few people to realize when we had Iran-Contra under Ronald Reagan. And General Secord was testifying, and they were moving millions of dollars through Switzerland. But if that was going on, Ella, 30 years ago, what took them so long to move? Mm-hmm. Because they were part of it. That's the problem. The CIA has been moving money through Switzerland for all their cases and their drug runnings from Afghanistan and the Golden Triangle in Vietnam and Laos. Mm-hmm. It's a proven fact. All of this has been documented. It's not like I'm the one who's coming up with this new theory. It's fact. So the very fact that even President Obama sent $1.4 billion in cash to Tehran, but it was on a private jet from Geneva, Switzerland. What does that tell you, Ella? It tells you that the Swiss and the U.S. government are in bed together, and this is very dangerous.
I mean, there was indications of that for decades, in my
Precisely.
opinion.
But you're absolutely correct. After World War II, the Americans got most of the gold out of Europe with the help of the Swiss and the Swedish, and they took it. The Americans took it and put it in Fort Knox. It's a fact. There's plenty of documents on that. But so when you get into this whole story, your audience is probably saying to themselves, this story is just unbelievable. It's almost like it couldn't have happened. It did happen. I saw it. I witnessed the corruption within the Department of Justice, the incompetence, the people that were doing these things, the rich and powerful. This was something that will never happen again. It's over.
Oh, trust me, my listeners would not find this unbelievable. They're pretty savvy. They would just believe it to be true if they don't know some of this already.
Well, that's right. And I think, going to my website, as I said, lucifersbanker.com, and hopefully reading my book. And the book is there to educate. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I lecture to people and to universities. And I'm happy to come to any school that wants me to come and talk, because we have to engage business school students, law school students, faculty, lay people, to understand the complexity of what goes on in the financial markets, but more importantly, the corruption that goes on between governments. And this is exactly what's gone on. And in my book, I exposed one client to the DOJ, and they did nothing. He had $420 million in secret numbered accounts and lived in a $50 million condominium in New York City. But he was an Iraqi national. And when a reporter did a story about me, they were shocked by this. And the station chief of the CIA in Baghdad said, don't go after this guy. And I said, I don't really give a damn what you say. I'm still putting his name in my book. And if he wants to sue me, fine, bring it on. It's just frightening. And when I did my 60 Minutes interview, which they deleted most of my interview, and they cheated the American people. 60 Minutes is a fraudulent network, I must tell you.
Well, it's controlled. Many of us know that.
Yeah. Exactly. But this was very bad because when I was there talking, I said, I can't understand. This gentleman was making illegal oil sales with Saddam Hussein. He had $420 million in 6 numbered accounts in Geneva with my boss, and he had lived in a $50 million condo in the Olympic Tower in New York City. And they said, well, we're not interested in non-Americans. And I said to Steve Croft on 60 Minutes, I said, well, maybe we are not interested in the people who flew the planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. They were non-Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I'm talking about, is that this is the cover-up, that it was so prevalent. It was so subversive. It was bad. And this is what goes on. And your audience should be outraged, because this is what goes on. They pay their taxes, but yet all these very wealthy and elite people get away with this. Why? And that's the problem. Mm-hmm. The powers that be control and don't want to enforce the laws equally. And that's a big problem in the United States. I witnessed it. As I said, I was the only banker in the world to go to jail in the financial crisis, but I was the whistleblower.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Here you were leading this wonderful life. I mean, I'm sure you had vacations and living this lavish lifestyle. What was it like going from that life to prison?
Well, it was funny. I talked to my brother about it, and I talked about it in my book. When I was in military school was much tougher than this prison. The prison I went to was called a camp. There was no prison cell. There was no fence.
Okay.
It was
unlike John Kerry Cow, because he ended up in a horrible prison. But okay,
well,
so
that's right. Yes, it was called Club Fed, and jokingly, I played bocce in the morning, have my coffee, play some softball or tennis in the afternoon.
I see.
I mean, it was a joke, and the taxpayers paid for this. So what I did was I was very adamant in there to help other inmates file appeals. I was being interviewed by major media outlets around the world every other week. And they were just like, why are we dealing with this guy? This guy's toxic, because I kept speaking my mind. And I gave a press conference right before I reported at the prison, and they put me in solitary confinement for the weekend. And I said, well, I'm going to have to call my attorney because you're trying to infringe upon my First Amendment rights. They panicked. They didn't know what to do.
Right.
No one talked to him this way. But I was so vigilant. I was so determined, and I was angry because I thought, this is not the America I knew. And now, unfortunately, I don't live in America. I live outside the States, just because I prefer not to. Not that I dislike America, I just dislike the system. And I know for a fact it's corrupt, and that's why I don't want to be a part of that. So I think it's a very interesting story for your audience to look into and to question it, and to talk to their children about what's right in life and what we do if we see something wrong. Do we do the right thing, or do we keep our mouth shut? And I always say silence is complicity. If you see something, say something.
That's right.
Right?
I agree with you. And before we went live, we were talking about that you knew John, and his story is horrific. That leads me to my next question, actually, is I know you've had this opportunity now to meet other fellow whistleblowers, and who have you met that you really connected with, or who was one of your favorite whistleblowers, I guess is my question.
Well, there's so many of them. I mean, as I said, I knew Harry Markopoulos because he's a Bostonian, but one gentleman who doesn't get as much notice as, say, John Kirikou or Thomas Drake or what have you, is a gentleman by the name of Robert McLean. He was the TSA whistleblower who actually went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won a 7-2 ruling. They had to reinstate him, give him back pay and so forth, but they're still harassing him. The TSA is another just sewage dump.
Brad, the show is ending. You want to go ahead and give your website again and where to get your book at? And we'll have to maybe have another interview.
Sure. It's lucifersbanker.com, and you can go online and buy it through Amazon and so forth. And I hope your audience goes to the website and reads my book. It's a wonderful read.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this interview so much. I really appreciate it. You have a good one.
Thank you so much, Ella.
And don't forget to donate to our station, freedomslips.com.